So our lecture now is covering inductive reasoning. And in our last lecture, part one of formal logic, we were focusing specifically on deductive arguments. So we looked at categorical syllogisms, we looked at hypothetical syllogisms, disjunctive syllogisms, and we looked at a reductio ad absurdum argument. And deductive arguments are the type of arguments that are set up in such a way that once you notice the logical connections between each premise, the conclusion certainly follows. Inductive reasoning is a little bit different, and so we're going to look at inductive reasoning now, and how inductive reasoning leads to probable conclusions, not certain conclusions. And then after we look at inductive reasoning, we'll look at abductive reasoning, which there are some similarities between abductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. There are also some important differences, which I'll note there. But for inductive reasoning, what we're doing is we're trying to arrive at a general conclusion from a series of specific pieces of evidence. So if you look at the structure of an inductive argument, it might be set up like this. So say you have a set of statistics that when you evaluate those statistics, it leads to, or at least it points to, a probabilistic conclusion. Now you can add to those statistics with a set of examples. And those examples, you could say, also point to the same conclusion. And then maybe you have, say, a testimony that also leads to a certain conclusion. And remember, these are probabilistic cases, not certain cases. And what you do is you put all the different lines of evidence together that might form distinct premises, but they are all pointing to the same conclusion. So this is how inductive arguments work. Note that when you set up an inductive argument, you might arrange them in premises, but the premises aren't necessarily connected to each other. The premises are just a line of evidence that would point to a conclusion. So the statistics point to this conclusion, different examples point to this conclusion, and then based on testimony it points to this conclusion. So on all that different lines of evidence, we think it's reasonable to conclude, say, X. So there are distinct premises that all point to the same conclusion. Now if you want to get into some examples of how this might work, let's take the example regarding swans. So we might set out an argument. All swans that we have seen have been white. Therefore, we conclude that the next swan that we see will probably be white. Now again, we need to emphasize this word probably. So inductive arguments are not leading to certain conclusions. Rather, inductive arguments lead to probabilistic conclusions because, of course, you can always come up with a situation later where the next swan that you see is not white, and therefore the conclusion doesn't follow certainly from the premises, it just follows probabilistically from the conclusions. So if you want to set it up into some sort of syllogism, you might set it up like this. The first swan that we saw was white. Premise 2, the second swan that we saw was also white. Premise 3, the third swan that we saw was also white, all the way down to, let's say we saw 1,001 swans, and all of them were white. So what is the conclusion? Well, the conclusion, you might say, therefore all swans are right, but that's not specifically an inductive argument. What you want to say with induction is therefore all swans are probably white, because you want to leave open the door that the next swan will not in fact be white. So this is how inductive arguments work. So now we're going to look at a short clip from Sherlock Holmes to show how inductive reasoning works. And this is, you might also say this type of argument is that Sherlock Holmes used as a bridge between inductive reasoning and abductive reasoning. So let's watch.
Watson. Oh, my goodness. What a pleasure. For the life of me, I don't know why it's taken him so long to introduce us properly.
Pleasure is mine. It really is quite a thrill to meet you, Mr. Holmes. I've heard so much about you. I have a pile of detective novels at home, Rocky Collins, Poe.
It's true.
It can seem a little far-fetched, though, sometimes, making these grand assumptions out of such tiny details.
That's not quite right, is it? In fact, the little details are by far the most important. Take Watson.
I intend to.
See his walking stick, a rare African snake wood, hiding a blade, 5 tensile steel. A few were awarded to veterans of the Afghan War, so I can assume he's a decorated soldier, strong, brave, born to be a man of action. And neat, like all military men. Now, I check his pockets. A stump from a boxing match. Now, I can infer that he's a bit of a gambler. I'd keep an eye on that dowry if I were you. Those days are behind you. It's cost us the rent more than once.
Well, with all due respect, Mr. Holmes, you know John very well. What about a complete stranger? What can you tell about me?
I don't think that's... I don't know that that's... Not a dinner, perhaps some other time.
I insist.
You insist. You remember we discussed this. The lady insists. You're a governess.
Well done.
Yes, well done. Shall we? Waiter. Your student. Is a boy of age.
Charlie's 7, actually.
Finished tall for his age. He flicked ink at you today.
Is there ink on my face?
There's nothing wrong with your face. There are 2 drops on your ear, in fact. India blue is nearly impossible to wash off. Anyway, a very impetuous act by the boy, but you're too experienced to react rashly, which is why the lady for whom you worked lent you that necklace. Oriental pearls, diamonds, a flawless ruby, hardly the gems of governance. However, the jewels you are not wearing tell us rather more. Holmes, you were engaged. The ring is gone, but the lighter skin, but at once sad, suggests that you spent some time abroad, wearing it proudly. That is, until you were informed of its true and rather modest worth, at which point you broke off the engagement and returned to England for better prospects. Doctor, perhaps.
Right on all counts, Mr. Holmes, apart from one. I didn't believe him. He died.
So in that clip, you can see how Sherlock Holmes argues for some of his cases, and there really is a blend between inductive reasoning and abductive reasoning. So he's gathering a number of different lines of evidence to lead to a probabilistic conclusion, and as you can see, the conclusion that he comes to is not quite correct, and the gal that he's speaking to there says you've got everything right except for this. And this is actually when you get into abductive arguments. So abductive arguments is similar, but again I said distinct. You use abductive reasoning when you're trying to explain a set of facts that you have in the present, and you're trying to figure out what is the cause that led to exactly what you're seeing in the present. So we might think of an argument or think of a case study where we're trying to figure out why is my driveway wet. So there's a picture on your screen with a wet driveway. So this is a situation that you have in the present, and you want to consider different explanations for how the driveway became wet. So right now we'll think of 4 possible explanations that could explain why my driveway is wet. The first explanation might be the case that the neighbor kids were having a water balloon fight last night, and their water balloon fight lasted all through the night, and they got my ground completely drenched, they got my driveway drenched, and so when I woke up this morning, this is why my driveway is wet. So that would be one possible explanation. The next explanation might be because I have a broken sprinkler somewhere, and that accounts for why my driveway is wet. Or maybe I have a backed up septic tank, and that can explain why there is a wet driveway. Or maybe it's the case that there was rainfall last night, and that explains why my driveway is wet. Now we've just listed 4 possible explanations. We could probably come up with others. Well, what you do in abductive reasoning is you want to figure out what is the best explanation given the facts that we know in the present. So, if you want to figure out what the best explanation is, you would probably go outside and start examining all the types of facts that you can gather in the present. One fact would maybe just be the fact that there are no balloon shrapnel in the yard. And so if you don't see any busted water balloons, then it seems to be the case that the water balloon fight explanation is not the strongest explanation. Now, certainly you could come up with a counter to that and say, well, maybe the neighbor kids are just very responsible, and they went around and they picked up all the fragments of water balloons that were on the ground, not leaving a trace of evidence. That could be the case. But what you want to ask when you're doing abductive reasoning is whether or not that is the simplest explanation. So if you have to multiply a number of alternative explanations to explain why your first explanation is the best one, usually that's not the best explanation. So you can move on to explanation number 2. Maybe it was a broken sprinkler. Well, then you just go and examine your sprinkler system. And if you have a sprinkler system and everything seems to be correctly attached, there's no leaking, then obviously that explanation would be wrong. And then backed up septic tank, maybe you'd start to smell the air. If it doesn't smell bad, then that's probably not the right explanation. And then you can conclude maybe it was rainfall. And then maybe you go and look at the forecast or what the forecast was for last night. And if the forecast said that there was rain, then that probably is the best explanation. So a thing that's similar about abductive arguments to, say, inductive arguments is that both arguments are leading to probabilistic conclusions but not certain conclusions. Now it's also important to note that when you're doing abductive reasoning, if you set it up as a syllogism, you're actually committing a fallacy. And it's important to recognize this and think about how you might overcome this particular fallacy. So you would set up, say, premise 1, if it rains, the driveway will be wet. Okay, we accept that premise. Premise 2, the driveway is wet. Conclusion, therefore it rained. Now if you remember back to deductive logic in our last lecture, this is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Because if you set it up, it's if P then Q, Q, therefore P. We'll note how this is a fallacy, why this is a fallacy, because obviously there can be multiple reasons for why the driveway is wet. So it could be the case that your driveway is wet because the neighbor kids had a balloon fight, and that would make your driveway wet. Or maybe your friends were washing their car in your driveway, or whatever else it could be. There could be many explanations for why your driveway is wet. So we have to recognize that if we're using this argument deductively, then it would be a logical fallacy. But if you use this argument abductively, then it's not a fallacy. But of course we need to explain why it's not a fallacy. So the first thing I should note is that this is the logic of all historical investigation, which means all historical investigation is affirming the consequent. So if we are indeed stuck in a fallacy when it comes to abductive reasoning, then that means that historical investigation should be thrown out. I don't think that's the case. Most logicians don't think that's the case. But of course we need to figure out why it's not the case. So when we are doing abductive reasoning, let's say we're trying to figure out what the cause of a person's death is. And so we have a line of evidence here. Here we have a skull in the picture that you can see, and we can find some evidence surrounding the skull. Maybe we can date it using some sort of radiometric dating. But if you ask, how could we determine what the cause of death is, knowing that we are committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent? And here's how I think we can do it. So when we're using abductive reasoning, we know that there was some cause that brought about the effect in question. So when we are saying if P, we're saying that there was a cause, or at least, any number of causes that led to the effect in question. So it is the case that some cause brought about some effect. What we're trying to do in abductive reasoning is we're trying to eliminate possible explanations, and so our conclusion, again, is not a certain conclusion, but it's saying this is the best conclusion that we have so far. This is an inference to the best explanation, if you want to call it that. So as we're going through a number of possible explanations, so I should also note here that an explanation is different than a cause. So what we're affirming, again, is that there was some cause that happened that led to the effect. Our explanation is an attempt to figure out what that cause was. And if you can rule out, say, causes A, C, and D, then your conclusion is that so far as we know, explanation B is the best explanation that we have to explain how the effect happened, how Q happened. And so that's all that we have. And so when we get to our conclusion, all we're saying is that this is the best explanation that we have so far. And so when you do that abductively, you're not committing a fallacy because you're not saying this is the certain conclusion. You're just saying it's the best that we have so far. So we use abduction whenever there are multiple explanations for the same set of facts. And this happens commonly. This is actually typically the type of argumentation that's used by detectives and scientists studying historical questions. So paleontology, origin of life studies, different branches of cosmology would use this type of reasoning. So now this leads to a question. Okay, so how do we determine what is the best explanation for any given set of facts? One way that logicians think about this is they try to find causes that are now in operation. So what causes can we think of right now that are known to create the effect in question? So best explanation doesn't mean something that's ideologically satisfying, because obviously we want to allow for explanations that challenge the prevailing ideology. It also doesn't mean the mainstream explanation. It means the best explanation is something that appeals to a cause that's already known, and again, that can produce the effect in question. So here might be an example. So we have if P, so cause 1, then Q, which is effect 1. So the effect here is a car that's completely covered in ash. It's completely covered in dust. And so we want to figure out what is the best explanation that we have that gets at the cause to this effect. Well, we could say maybe there was an earthquake that caused this ash to happen. Well, if earthquakes aren't known to cause this type of effect, then we can rule that out. Maybe this is a car, a truck that's never been driven before, and it's just accumulated so much dust over the years. But of course, we can't think of an example where that actually has happened. Maybe it was a campfire that deposited a bunch of ash on this truck. But again, have we seen campfires that have done that before, that have gone on long enough to do that? So that doesn't seem to be a strong explanation. And so we come to a volcano. Have volcanoes been known to cause this type of effect? And if the answer is yes, then so far the volcano is the best explanation for this effect, because we already know, and we've seen examples where volcanoes have been known to cause this effect in question. And so that's what it means to come up with a best explanation. So that will conclude our section on formal logic. So again, to get kind of just a big picture of logic and critical thinking, a few lectures ago we looked at informal logic, where we were touching on critical thinking, logical fallacies, basically the logic of everyday life. Then we spent one lecture talking about deduction. This time we've been talking about induction and abduction. But there are two basic branches of logic, and we'll maybe have time to dig into